Hey guys, this is Tamara. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about intergenerational trauma. And this is a topic that I talk a lot about. Most people know my work as being really focused on trauma throughout the lifespan, trauma throughout generations. So this is an area of expertise for me. So thank you so much for coming back to my channel for those who are subscribed. And for those who are new and who are not subscribed, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button so that you guys can stick around with us. The benefits in today's video for you is that you're going to learn about my 3-stage model that talks about intergenerational trauma and the stages, the 3 stages that I think we can experience. I also want to talk about risk and protective factors. Okay, so let's just go ahead and jump in. Let me give you a broad definition of what intergenerational trauma is, okay? Intergenerational trauma describes a set of circumstances that has happened to an individual that has then been passed on through generations from that individual. So a first-generation grandparent may have experienced slavery, may have experienced severe child neglect and abuse, maybe racial and cultural segregation, discrimination. That stress from that first generation family member, that grandparent, passes down to the grandparent's child, then to the grandchild, okay, and then to the child's child, and it continues on throughout the family history. It has a specific impact, that intergenerational trauma, that trauma for the first generation family member has a specific impact on the way that the family processes things psychologically, the way that the family processes things emotionally, the way that the family processes things neurologically as well, because I believe that trauma is not just psychological and emotional, but it's also neurological. It has an imprint on the brain. And when you have an imprint on the brain, like trauma creates, that can actually cause different behaviors, a set of attitudes, right? Different personalities, just a lot of neurological and psychological changes that can then affect somebody who's under that person who's suffering, right? So somebody who is the child to that individual who's going through the neurological changes. So intergenerational trauma is pretty interesting just for that reason. Research backs the idea that intergenerational trauma can really be experienced vicariously. Think about, if you've seen movies like Roots, if you've seen documentaries about the Native Americans and how there was tons and tons of bloodshed, they were pushed out of what they had at the time. They were pushed out of an area that they had found and claimed and made their land. And if you go back into history and you read over, or sometimes there's documentaries available at the library, if you watch some of these things, it's going to disturb you, and it can actually change how you perceive things. It can change how you interact with people. It could change how defensive you become. And so this is the imprint of intergenerational trauma. It has a way of affecting you whether or not you've experienced the trauma yourself. So I'm sure a lot of you can relate to the theories of intergenerational trauma. In my family, we have a long history of intergenerational trauma. I have both Native American and African American heritages, as well as German roots. But for the main part, I've always been really immersed in my African American and Native American heritage. And both heritages have histories that I could not escape. And even aside from the cultural intergenerational trauma, I had family trauma as well that started way back on my maternal side and on my paternal side as well. So my grandmother and then my father's side, there were situations that really impacted them. It caused alcoholism and depression and anxiety and PTSD. And unfortunately, if the person who's experiencing the trauma doesn't get help, then they have children, they have families, and they impact them negatively because they're not getting help. And that's what happened in my own family. my mother and uncle were impacted, and my grandmother was impacted, and my grandmother's siblings were impacted, and so it passed down to my mom and my uncle, cousins, aunts, that kind of thing. Thankfully, myself and my cousins, we said, you know what, the trauma stops right here. We're done with this. We're not going to allow this to happen, right? We're not going to be held captive by a long lineage of emotional, psychological trauma. It's not worth it. And so thank God we were able to work ourselves around that. But some people do not. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's called risk factors. I'm sure you guys have heard about risk and protective factors, Risk factors are things that make us more vulnerable to life. They're basically things that weaken our defenses, okay? So risk factors may include an alcoholic parent. It may include a depressed and psychotic parent or family member, poor grades, delinquency, fire setting, untreated mental illness, substance abuse, divorce, single parent households, right? Child neglect, child abuse, sexual abuse, rape. Those are all risk factors. And risk factors are things, once again, that make us vulnerable to life. They set us back emotionally and psychologically, and it makes it harder for us to be resilient. And so imagine being a part of a younger generation, and you have a lineage, a long generation of trauma. Well, if you have a ton of risk factors, the odds are stacked against you, right? If you have a single parent, a drug addict parent, a depressed parent, a parent who's absent, there's all your risk factors right there. So you're going to be a depressed teen, a lonely teen, a stimulation-seeking teenager. All of those things are risk factors, okay? Protective factors are things that protect us. My mom did an excellent job at raising 3 kids, 2 boys and 1 girl, and she did an excellent job in ensuring that we had tons of protective factors. Private school, love, compassion, being heard, right? Homeschooling us when we got to a certain age, making us travel, making us, see the world and appreciate our other heritage. Even though my family was like African-American, my mom was like, no, that's good too, but we also have Native American Cherokee roots, and I'm going to make sure that my kids get that knowledge. So she did that, and we did ancestral searches. We did all kind of biology tests, and it was just the coolest thing. And my mom did an excellent job of making sure that we had protective factors. So that's what you want if you have a long lineage of trauma within your family. All right, so let me talk about these 3 stages I think we go through. So stage number 1 is what I call the self, family, and social trap, okay? And that is stage 1. And what I mean by that is because of the trauma, you experience powerlessness, you experience lack of control, and you experience learned helplessness. I'm going to post a video up here where I talked about learned helplessness. You can go back and look at that. And then I'm going to post another video right here for you that talks about intergenerational trauma and my view of that. All right. Stage number 2 is basically because you have these feelings of powerlessness, you have a lack of control, you might be very impulsive, risk taking, you may be thrill seeking, and you may also feel helpless because of that. Stage number 2, you can slide into victim cycle. And so it's a little bit hard for you to get out of the mentality that there's hope for you, right? You may also experience vicarious trauma. You may see things in your lifetime that has made it way more difficult for you to get out of the victim cycle. Okay, now stage number 3 is what I like to call shared helplessness. You move into a different stage of your life where you may be married or dating, you may have children, right? You may be pregnant, have a baby on the way. You may be a man who is taking on stepchildren. Well, I call it shared helplessness because if you're not healthy, then you're going to spread that helplessness and powerlessness and that self-consciousness and lack of confidence to those other people in your lives. So these are 3 stages, guys, that I like to educate my clients to, because while there's little research on this, there's some research that backs the idea that intergenerational trauma affects you throughout the lifespan. You're never going to get over it. You may be able to cope, but you're not going to be able to get over it. So I'm going to post these stages in the description box below for you so you can take a look at them. All right, guys? Thank you so much for being with me today in this video. I encourage you to give it a thumbs up if it was helpful to you. I will come back on Wednesday with a new video. We're going to keep talking about these things, guys, and I'm going to get to some of the topics that we put in the community community section and some of the topics that you guys had voted for. So I will definitely see you soon with those. All right, guys. Bye-bye.